This is 20 Minutes Live. Welcome to all of you from India and around the world. I'm Ninad Karpe, partner at 100x.vc. Today on 20 Minutes Live, we are truly delighted to have Dr. Vikram Patel as our guest. Vikram Patel is a Pershing Square Professor of Global Health and Wellcome Trust Principal Research Fellow at the Harvard Medical School. He co-leads the Global Mental Health at Harvard Initiative. Vikram's work has focused on the burden of mental health problems, their association with social disadvantage, and the use of community resources for their prevention and treatment. He's a co-founder of the Movement for Global Mental Health, the Center for Global Mental Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the Mental Health Innovation Network, and Sangat, an Indian NGO which won the WHO Public Health Champion of India Prize. He's a fellow of the UK's Academy of Medical Sciences and has served on the committee which drafted India's first national mental health policy and the WHO High-Level Independent Commission for NCDs. Vikram's awards are impressive, prestigious, and just too many to name, so I won't even make an attempt. He was listed in Time magazine's 100 Most Influential Persons of the Year in 2015. Welcome, Vikram, to our show, 20 Minutes Live. We are so delighted you could join us today. Our format is simple, unique, and crisp. Vikram will speak for 10 minutes on the topic, and after that, we'll have a round of Q&A for 10 minutes. Viewers, this is your chance to talk to Vikram directly, ask him a question on this very, very important topic. Don't wait. Whatever you want to ask as Vikram speaks, go on a comments column on your screen and just put your question. After he's done for the first 10 minutes, I'll take up the questions. Thank you, Vikram, and over to you.
Thank you, Ninad. So let me launch straight into why mental health matters to all of us. To be quite honest, Ninad, in my 25-year career as a psychiatrist working in both clinical and public health settings, I have never seen the subject of mental health being discussed so openly, being so central to conversations both in India and around the world. Most recently, the suicide of the celebrated actor Sushant Singh Rajput, days after that of his manager, which in turn precipitated the public acknowledgement by one of India's prominent young politicians, Milind Deora, of his own interest with depression, has thrust mental health absolutely into the spotlight. But it's really important for me to stress to the audience that mental health is not just mental illness. And the key important point about this conversation is broadening the discourse about mental health so that we can finally recognize it for what it actually is, that it is something which is a personal asset. It is the single most important aspect of ourselves that defines our very personhood. For consider this. What makes us who we are as human beings? It isn't really the skin that we have around our bodies. It isn't our bones. It isn't the hair. It's actually the Trimurti or of our emotions, the way we think, and the way we behave with one another. It is this Trimurti which actually defines our mental health. And it's important also to recognize that our conscious awareness and our mental health is with us right through our life, both when we're awake and when we're asleep, and is the foundation of the capabilities that we have, capabilities that are essential in our day-to-day life, things that we actually often take for granted until, of course, our mental health is impaired and we realize how precious and important it is in our everyday life. I wanted to also say a few words about what we now understand about our mental health in terms of its origins. And it's very clear that no single factor can explain who we are and why we experience the world in such different ways every moment of our lives. It's very clear that our genes play a role, but it's also very clear that our early life experiences, particularly in the first 2 decades of our life at home and in school, and then our current environment at work, for example, or in our relationships, profoundly affect our mental health. And if you begin to imagine the unique nature of this complex interplay of genes, early life experiences, and what's happening to us right now, you can begin to see why each person's mental health is the product of a very unique personal life story. Now, I want to turn to the issue about, of course, mental health in the time of this pandemic. I think of the mental health consequences of this pandemic as playing out in two broad phases. The first phase is where we are right now. It began really at the beginning of the year, and I would call this the pandemic of fear. It's largely the result of the profound uncertainties that have overwhelmed all of our lives. If one considers the sheer breadth of these uncertainties, Ninad, from our personal risk of being infected, the fear for our family and friends, the fear about being lonely, the hassles of working from home and not knowing when that will end, and of course, the broader existential fear about when our country will return to normal, when this world will return to normal. If you consider all these uncertainties and recognize that uncertainties are probably the most toxic influence on our mental health, then it is not at all surprising that experiences of anxiety, fearfulness, sleep problems, irritability, fluctuating moods, and hopelessness have become widespread. The important point I want to make here is that these are completely rational responses of our minds to the extraordinary realities we are facing. Let us not forget that anxiety is an evolutionary response to uncertainty, and it is intended to make the human being prepared for the uncertainty. What is really dangerous is when that uncertainty persists for as long as it has now, and there is no signal of when it might potentially end. That is when this chronic, enduring uncertainty and anxiety begins to wear away at our mental health. And that takes me to the second phase that is going to play itself out in the months and years ahead. And to me, this is far more sinister because this second phase promises the emergence of an epidemic of clinically significant mental health problems. And here I want to really refer to the work of the Nobel Prize winning economist Angus Deaton, who has documented the profound impact of the last recession that mainly affected America, the US, where he demonstrated that a reduction of life expectancy in working age Americans was largely driven by suicide and substance use. By all accounts, the economic recession facing the world and India in particular will be incomparably greater than what happened in 2008. And it's important for us to remember, Ninad, that our healthcare system has been completely unable to address mental health needs. By the accounts of the government's own statistics, about 10% of India's people were affected by clinically significant mental health problems before COVID 19. And back then, less than 5% of India's people were able to access mental health care. Can you imagine the perfect storm that this makes for the future of the mental health of our people? And let's be very clear that the mental health problems that affect individuals also profoundly affect their families. And for those of you who work in the business sector, they profoundly affect economic productivity. And this is why mental health problems are recognized as one of the leading drags on the economies of nations. Let me end by looking at the solution, really. One of the important things that's happened in the last 4 months has been the flourishing of initiatives to address mental health difficulties, particularly through telemedicine platforms. And this is very welcome. However, it's important to remember that the telemedicine platforms can only reach some people because of the large digital divide in our country. Nevertheless, these initiatives are very welcome, and I hope that we will see a lot more people accessing mental health care using these platforms. But for me, what holds the greatest promise for a country of our size, our diversity, and the lack of resources in most parts of our country are the frugal innovations that organizations like Sangat have been developing. And I want to end with one tremendous example of such an innovation. Sangat, about 5 or 6 years ago, developed a 6 session treatment for depression, a psychological treatment that was designed to be delivered by peers, by community-based workers, by pretty much anyone, including anyone in the audience. And we were able to demonstrate the effectiveness of this intervention in routine primary healthcare settings in Goa. This work was replicated in Nepal, has now been taken to many other developing countries. But here's the amazing thing, Ninad. This treatment is being taken to the US and Canada as I speak. An innovation that was developed primarily for low resource settings in India by an Indian NGO is now being reverse engineered for outreach and scale up in two of the world's wealthiest countries. I think in this way, we're able to reimagine what mental health care can look like. And at the heart of this reimagination is that mental health is everyone's business, not just that of mental health specialists. So that in the long run, as we begin to think about how we rebuild our mental health care system, we're not only putting more money into the system, but we're also embracing the diversity of the experiences of mental health and the strategies which work well beyond the narrow confines of what I call the 3Ds: doctors, diagnoses, and drugs. I can't imagine a more valuable investment in response to what I consider the most serious crisis facing our country since our independence. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikram. The most serious crisis facing our country. You narrated the problems. You also gave solutions. That was fairly comprehensive in the 10 minutes. I would like to jump straight, if you don't mind, to a lot of questions which have come from viewers. And since there are tons of questions, your response ideally could be as crisp as possible. So Luis Miranda has asked two questions, and I will try and combine both. First question is asking is how open is it now? Is it getting better in India? Discussion surrounding mental health, is there social taboo still there? And the second one is in terms of solutions. He's asking, are support groups important, significant in helping people with mental health?
The answer to both is yes. Very briefly, I cannot imagine a time when we were more able to talk about mental health in the way we are now, without fear, without shame, and without really any kind of stigma. And the way the media has been reporting mental health, generally speaking, has been far more sensitive and far more in depth than it used to be in the past. So yes, stigma is much less. And secondly, yes, support groups are incredibly powerful. And let me tell you one thing. I think the lived experience of mental health problems is one of the most powerful ways of destigmatizing mental health. The personal story is a very powerful way, but it's also a very powerful way of extending support to others who are suffering, because these are experts by experience. I call them that, rather than experts by professional training, as is in my case. So we need both kinds of expertise to help people recover.
So Janki was with me in college. She's now in Chennai. She's asking, is this period led to women facing mental health issues because fear of domestic violence has increased? Has it increased, and has the fear and mental challenges surrounding that increased?
Yeah, absolutely, Janki. I didn't, in the short time I had, I did not really say a very important point, that the mental health problems that we're seeing in our population are not evenly distributed. Certain groups are much more at risk. And one important such group is women, for two reasons. Of course, it's linked to the gendered nature of relations, social relations in India. And so that affects two important aspects. First of all, it increases the risk of gender-based violence. And yes, there is very concrete evidence that's happening. Women's reproductive and sexual health needs have also not been met because of the closure of health services. By some estimates, there have been 5 million unwanted pregnancies in the last 4 months. So, this is profoundly going to affect women's well-being beyond just violence. And the second, of course, is the fact that women have now pivoted to doing all their roles from home, which means that women who are working now are saddled not only with their work, but also their home duties, because they're stuck at home, and because their kids are not going to school, they're also stuck now with parenting duties. And so in the highly gendered nature of social relations in India, this means women are having to bear a triple burden during this last 4 months of our lockdown.
So Manish is asking a very short and sweet question. You referred to telemedicine. He's asking about health apps in general, or wellness apps. Are they somewhat effective, if not very effective?
They're definitely somewhat effective. The problem with these health apps is that very few people engage with them. But if you're persistent with these apps, it's important to remember that thousands of apps, and I would strongly recommend you just go online to look at which apps have been reviewed by independent agencies, for example, the FDA, and you will see that certain apps have got a much stronger evidence base backing them in terms of the effects they have, and I would recommend using those apps. Not all these apps are free, by the way, but I think it's good value for money, because you can actually use those apps at your own pace. The key point here to make is that the apps only work if you engage with them. If you give up after a couple of logins, then they're obviously not going to work, just as if you don't follow up with your therapist and complete a course of treatment. The best kinds of apps are the ones that also involve some coaching, and there are certain apps that allow you to access coaches as well. Those give you the most bang for your buck, but of course they will cost a bit more as well.
So there are two, three people, who want more details of your 6 point program, which you mentioned. Can you kind of direct them to a website? Or one person, in fact, is asking, is it open source? How do I know, get more details? There are a couple of people who have asked questions.
Yeah, so this treatment is very much open source, because it's done through the work of a publicly funded medical research charity and through an NGO. So the treatment's called the Healthy Activity Program, and it's available on the Sangat website. That said, to learn the treatment, we are currently restricting this only to health workers because, for obvious reasons, we don't think this is like driving a car where you can become an Uber driver by just getting a license. I think there needs to be some safeguards as well. We do want not to dilute the importance of depression as a very significant cause of suffering. And this treatment is for people with clinically significant depression. It's not, as it were, for people who are going through periods of feeling distressed because of acute events. And so for now, we're restricting this to working with state governments, their healthcare systems, and in the US, we're working with, again, mental health programs. But we hope that once these curricula have been tested within organized healthcare systems, that we will also, in a managed way, make them available for the general community. And that is certainly work we are launching right now. And hopefully within the next 6 to 8 months, we will have curricula available for the general public.
So there are one or two questions, including a girl, Ashna, who's probably a startup entrepreneur founder. As you're familiar, India's a lot of startups are coming up, and she's asking, entrepreneurship or startups leads to a lot of stress, and obviously it can lead to mental health problems. Is there any particular tip or anything special you would like to say to young, particularly the young people watching this program now?
Yeah,
More in startups and not so in startups, but a young crowd.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to just stress the point I made earlier that, if you're feeling distressed, you're not alone. Actually, it's probably the norm to feel distressed right now. And I think you should first recognize that these are extraordinary situations and no human brain was wired to experience something like what we've experienced right now. So just accept it. Acknowledge that this is an extraordinary situation and your brain is reacting to that with these sorts of distressing feelings. That said, you need to acknowledge your feelings as well. And I often give the analogy, if you had an acute pain in your chest suddenly, what would you do about it? Well, the first thing you do is recognize there's something wrong, and you'd immediately go to someone you love or someone you trust and say, hey, I've got this problem, right? Do the same. Do the same with distressing emotional experiences. Treat it like the chest pain, but it's happening in your mind. Seek help by talking to someone you love or trust. I think there's a lot of other general mental health promotion stuff that I think you can find on the web. For example, stick to your routines, make sure you get some exercise in. But I think those are all going to help you as much as you can imagine. One more thing I will say that is very helpful is finding quiet time. Again, I'm sure you read about this. Try and censor the amount of time you spend with news and on the internet. Just find some quiet time. Quiet time means time where you can be a bit more meditative, reflective, and not connected to anything or which involves contact with the digital world.
So, do you recommend a digital detox, periodically?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if you had to ask me, that's how I manage my own mental health. I manage for me, my work is completely pivoted online. Ninad, I'm an academic. I have students, I have research programs. And, so I spend a lot of time potentially doing this. And I have to make sure that I manage my time very, very effectively to ensure that I don't spend so much time online that it overwhelms me. That said, by digital, I also meant media.
Right.
To restrict the amount of time that you're accessing the news and reading, forwards and so on and so forth. I'm very, very disciplined with how I manage my time doing that too.
So, Vikram, there are a couple of people. I'm trying to again paraphrase in the interest of time. You did mention you go and speak to your loved ones. So the question is surrounding that. What should be the first port of call if a person feels, he or she is anxious and probably getting into some mental health related issues? Can you just kind of again reiterate probably?
So I would say in more general, in a more generic way, it would be somebody that you trust. There is no one person that applies to everyone, obviously, because we're such a diverse people. But for me, for example, that would be a very close friend. It would be my wife. These would be the two people I would probably go to first. My sister. And so these are an example of people. I have in the past, when I've had difficulties with my mental health, I have consulted, for example, a colleague. But that's because I have access to colleagues in the mental health professional field. For those who are not in that situation, obviously that would mean a professional consultation. I wouldn't see that as a first port of call for sure, because remember that again in my emphasis of this being a normal, trying to normalize these mental health experiences, that would mean you would also go to someone who's very accessible in your everyday world as your first port of call, rather than necessarily a mental health professional.
So Tanvi is based in US, and she's asking, can you talk a little bit about the recent climate change and environment disasters? Are they causing a lot of anxiety? They are causing a lot of anxiety to young people. Is there any comment you want to make on that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of evidence on this. If you just think of what does climate change do? Climate change makes livelihoods more uncertain. For example, if you're in agriculture, that's going to make your livelihoods more uncertain. And the other thing it does also is it creates extreme events that cause huge amounts of humanitarian crises, like floods and so on. So if you think of both of these of well-established factors that affect your mental health, you can begin to see the chain of events from climate change to poor mental health. And so this is very well recognized. I want to say one thing about young people and how young people are mobilized in addressing climate change. And one of the questions you asked me, Ninad, is what can people do to help manage their mental health? It's to get involved with community action in whatever cause that is really important to you, because one of the really important protective factors to our mental health is being involved in meaningful, purposeful activities that don't only affect you personally, but affect some kind of social a cause that you are most passionate about. And that could be anything. And climate change is obviously one of them.
So Vikram, I'll take just last two questions and before letting you go, but I can't let you go without asking just two, three questions. Yasmin is based in Singapore. She's again, my college mate. A lot of my college mates are tuning in. So she and a lot of others have asked again the role of medicine versus therapy, combination of the two. How does it work?
Yeah, so the simple answer to this is they both work, but they work for, we don't know for whom it'll work. Unfortunately, the state of science today is that it's still very much a trial and error. What's important to remember is that if you try one thing and it doesn't work, you should try the other one. It isn't a competition between the two. My own preference is to go for psychological therapies first, mainly because there are no side effects. And once you start medication, you really do need to take it for the prescribed duration, particularly, for example, say for antidepressants, we're talking of anything between 6 to 12 months. And so that's a longer term commitment. But psychological therapies are very hard to access, unfortunately, and therefore medication may be the only option. But please don't see this as a competition. It isn't. Try whatever is accessible to you first, stick with it to the natural completion, and if it doesn't help you, then you switch to the other.
So I would want to ask you a last question and then ask you probably one or two personal questions. Some people have said, I want to help in this cause. Some one or two people have said, you have particularly been very instrumental in helping people who are socially underprivileged and, of course, financially underprivileged. Is there any way you would recommend, suggest to someone who's now listening to you saying, okay, let me help this cause as a societal cause? And one more person has asked, he still finds it taboo to discuss about it. So is there some way in which you can direct them somewhere, they can volunteer time or money, whatever it is, to contribute to this cause?
Yeah, I'll answer both those questions in one. To be honest, first of all, I'm so happy that you're, to hear those questions, because, the problem with the conversations about celebrated actors and actresses getting mental health problems is that it serves to perpetuate a myth. And that myth is that mental health issues are problems of the wealthy, people like us. People who are connected, digital, affluent, English speaking. It's not the truth. It's exactly the opposite. Actually, mental health problems are much commoner among those who are facing enormous stresses and don't have the resources to absorb them. And that is typically the poor, the marginalized, etc. And so, of course, it affects everyone in the community. But what I'm trying to say is that the poor have an additional set of stresses that make mental health problems worse in them, and they have no one to turn to. And so I would strongly recommend supporting civil society organizations that are actually reaching out to the poor and ensuring that when they're doing so, they're also addressing mental health components. Or else you also support mental health organizations, particularly, and there are many in India, and of course, Sangat is one of them, which is working explicitly with socially disadvantaged, rural, remote, marginalized populations. So there are many NGOs, and I'm very happy to speak to people separately about good examples of organizations. I want to also specify that mental health is a very broad range of concerns. Don't forget kids here. Kids with intellectual disabilities, autism, and so on often tend to be forgotten when we talk about mental health. But their needs, and think about this, we talk about schools and what's happening to kids when they're out of school. Think about children with disabilities. No one's even having a conversation about that. Schools were such important places for these children to socially engage with their peers, and now they're stuck at home. And what's happening to them? How are they being cared for? How are their parents coping? We really do need to urgently reach out to these families as well.
Okay, great, Vikram. Can I, if you, with your permission, ask you one or two personal question? I'm
Of course.
sure I can't let you go without that. All of us have been in lockdown, and you also spend a lot of time at home. Is there any new habit or new something new we have picked up in the last 4 months which you've never done before because of so much time you're spending at home?
Absolutely. My new habit is walking my dog. We
Oh,
got a dog about a year ago, but I never imagined I'd be spending so much time with her. I've completely adore her. And
okay.
so every day it's a ritual for me and my dog to go for a walk. We live in a beautiful little village in Goa. And it's absolutely pleasant. I don't know who enjoys it more, the dog or me, but it's terrific. I really enjoy it very, very much. It's also allowed me to explore little alleys in our village, which I haven't walked down for years. And that's been very, very pleasurable.
And the last question is, you do read a lot, is what we know. Any particular book you would like to recommend to our viewers here?
Wow, I've been reading a lot during this period. So let me think. Well, I'll tell you one book I read very recently, which comes to mind, which I strongly recommend, is Early Indians, and it's a terrific. It's a non-fiction book. I actually mostly read fiction, but that's a non-fiction book I really enjoyed because it's a beautifully simple exposition of this amazing new science of genomics, which has helped unpack our ancestry as Indians. And that's also politically and ideologically a very complex area. So it's really wonderful to read a scientific book, but written in a way that is accessible to anyone. And the other book I'm reading right now, again, is a nonfiction book, surprisingly, and a very fat one called Capital by Thomas Piketty. It's a slower but steady read, but I'm learning a lot about economics, which I'm really glad to come to grips with.
Great. So, Vikram, would you like to put some closing message to our viewers, and then we'll totally wind it down? Any last one message or two messages to our viewers as we close this session?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just repeat what I said earlier. Mental health is your most important
Sure.
asset. Look after it, be aware of it, acknowledge it, and when it is affected, do something about it.
Thank you, Vikram. We're delighted you could join us today. Spend time and give all these messages to our viewers. 20 minutes live is every Thursday. So viewers, remember next Thursday 5 p.m. Again, Vikram, thank you so much for joining us today. It was an amazing session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.